I'd now like to turn to the Roman, Latin writers of the period. Their achievements in the other arts, architecture, painting and sculpture, were rather second-rate and mostly in imitation of the Greeks. And it's true that Latin writers also wanted to emulate the Greeks and used their writers as models, but somehow the language wouldn't allow it. What I mean to say is, the particular qualities of the Latin tongue made for the excellence of their writings, especially the poetry. For one thing, Latin is capable of great compression. That is to say, it can convey in 5 or 6 words what we would need twice the number to say. What also helped Latin writing flourish was the nature of Roman education. Whatever its faults, as they would appear to us, its linguistic and literary emphasis seemed designed to produce orators and writers. A drawback of the system was that education was only available to the richer classes of society, and so Roman literature is mainly a product of those classes. This, in turn, meant that the subject matter was fairly limited and narrow in its social reach, though there were exceptions.
Hi everyone, my name is Chun Che. I teach in the Division of Ecoscience at Ewha Women's University. Far too many people often say things like, animals do this, but we don't. Or this animal does this and that animal does this, but the humans don't do things like that. Those statements have some hidden assumption that we're not animals. When we say animals do this, animals do that, we often assume that we're not animals. If we're not animals, what are we? Are we plants or trees or flowers? No, we're not. Then, okay, we're not plants. Then are we microorganisms, really tiny microscopic things? No, we're not. Then the natural conclusion must be we're not living things. Well, that's not true. Yes, we are animals. And I see animals in us, and I see humans in animals. So I'm going to talk about the animal behavior and human nature. In order to understand human nature, we can look into animals' eyes and animal behavior and find something about what made us who we are.
Talk about water and the law that surrounds drinking water, to talk about its quality, talk about what your rights are to clean water, to also give you a sense of what key threats are to drinking water, what your exposure might be, and what we might do about it, both legally but also personally. Water is a critical component of our environment in our bodies. Your body is close to 70% water. You can go for several weeks, 2 to 3 on average, without food. You can only go for about 4 minutes without air. and you can go for maybe 4 or 5 days without water before you die. So water is absolutely critical, and one of the key arguments I want to make today is that it's a largely neglected area of environmental law, given the rapid increase in our knowledge about chemical threats to water quality and where those threats come from.
Sound receptors. You've got sound receptors in your ear, and they're beautiful. We're not going to talk about them at any length, but there's little flappy, these little spiky things going along in your ear, and they can translate vibrational energy coming from your ear, hitting your eardrum, being translated into a vibration in the fluid in your ear, into a physical motion of these little receptors there, into an electrical motion, into an electrical signal that goes into your ear. So all that's pretty impressive stuff. We're not going to talk about the details of it, but I invite some of you who want to learn more about this, particularly MIT students, I think, find receptors to be really quite remarkable kinds of devices.
There can now be no reasonable science-based doubt about the reality of global climate change effects brought on by the cumulative and rapidly growing emission of so-called greenhouse gases, primarily carbon dioxide, into the atmosphere. As these effects become increasingly more obvious worldwide, so commercial interests, groups of concerned individuals, and national governments have been gripped by amounts of mass panic and what to do about it. To many of Paul Ehrlich's Malthusian population bomb of 1968 appears about to explode in the world's face in an indirect version of his millenarian vision of population growth, which outpaces agricultural production capacity, with predictably catastrophic results for humanity. And his three-part crisis scenario does indeed seem now to be present: a rapid rate of change, a limit of some sort, and delays in perceiving that limit. Ehrlich's work was roundly criticized at the time and later from many quarters, and much of what he predicted did not come about. Nevertheless, can the world afford to take the risk that the climate scientists have got it wrong? Is it not in everyone's interest to apply the precautionary principle in attempting to avoid the worst of their predictions, now rather than at some future time? As the chairman of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, Mr. Rajendra Pakuri has recently pointed out 11 of the warmest years since instrumental records began have occurred in the past 12 years, while major precipitation changes are taking place on a global scale.
Within most developed countries, notions of pragmatism, notions of the fact that we have democracies, have succeeded in tempering the market economy. In the 19th century, 18th century, the Industrial Revolution had some very negative effects on people, particularly working classes all over the world. We see data where life expectancy was reduced, heights were reduced. We can look at medical records and see that actually living standards in among large fractions of the population actually went down. But eventually we passed legislation about working conditions, and eventually we circumscribed some of the worst kinds of behavior. We eventually, in the 20th century, we put regulations that imposed better environmental conditions, and so some of the damage was reversed, and that we have made the market economy work in ways that the benefits of it are at least far more widely shared than they were 100 years ago.
Language death is not mainstream theatre. It is not mainstream anything. Can you imagine Hollywood taking it on? It's so far outside the mindsets of most people that they have a difficulty appreciating what the crisis is all about, because they're not used to thinking about language as an issue in itself. Somehow we need to change these mindsets. We need to get people thinking more about language, more explicitly, more intimately, more enthusiastically. Interest in language is certainly there in the general population. Most people are fascinated by such topics as where words come from, or what the origin of their town's name is, or whether their baby's name means anything. And they're certainly prepared to play Scrabble and a host of other language games ad infinitum. And you get language games on radio and television too, but a willingness to focus that interest on general issues, a preparedness to take on board the emotion and drama inherent in the situation of language endangerment, is not something that happens much.
So we were founded just over 10 years ago when I was in the Royal Academy, a museum in the centre of London, with my 3 children at the Aztec exhibition. I don't know if any of you saw it. I had an older child and 2 younger children, twins, strapped in a pushchair. And one of my children, 3 years old, shouted, and I've never denied he shouted, "Monster, monster," at this statue which looked just like a monster, had snakes for hair, a big beak for a nose, and I thought, this is fantastic. I've got a 3-year-old that's appreciating pre-Hispanic art. How good can it get? So I bent down and I said, yes, it looks just like a monster. And at that moment, a room warden came over, a gallery assistant came over and said we were being too noisy and threw us out. Wrong family. I was at that time a journalist with the Guardian newspaper, and 2 days later wrote a big piece in the Guardian about being thrown out of the Royal Academy. And what was really interesting was by the end of that day, we had at the paper over 500 emails from other families saying, museums aren't working for us, let's try and make it work. So that's what we did. In The Guardian, we set up a campaign. We called it the Kids Museums Campaign, but it didn't really exist. It was just a few pages. We ran loads of stories on it. I began touring the country, talking about how to make your museum family-friendly.
The first inhabitants in Australia were the ancestors of the present indigenous people. Whether these first migrations involved one or several successive waves and distinct peoples is still subject to academic debate, as is its timing. The minimum widely accepted time frame places presence of humans in Australia at 40,000 to 43,000 years before present, while the upper range supported by others is 60,000 to 70,000 years BP. In any event, this migration was achieved during the closing stages of the Pleistocene epoch, when sea levels were typically much lower than they are today. Repeated episodes of extended glaciation resulted in decreases of sea level by some 100,150 meters. The continental coastline therefore extended much further out into the Timor Sea than it does today, and Australia and New Guinea formed a single landmass, known as Sahel, connected by an extensive land bridge across the Afura Sea, Gulf of Carpentaria, and Torres Strait. The ancestral Australian Aboriginal peoples were thus long established and continued to develop, diversify, and settle through much of the continent. As the sea levels rose again at the terminus of the most recent glacial period some 10,000 years ago, the Australian continent once more became a separated landmass. However, the newly formed 150-kilometer-wide Torres Strait with its chain of islands still provided the means for cultural contact and trade between New Guinea and the northern Cape York Peninsula. During the 1970s and 1980s, around 120,000 Southern Asian refugees migrated to Australia. During that 20 years, Australia first began to adopt a policy of what Minister of Immigration Al Grass termed multiculturalism. In 2004 to 2005, Australia accepted 123,000 new settlers, 19, a 40% increase over the past 10 years. The largest number of immigrants, 40,000 in 2004 to 2005, moved to Sydney. The majority of immigrants came from Asia, led by China and India.
This is Scientific American's 60-Second Science. I'm Steve Mirsky. Got a minute? Why do bumblebees pick some flowers over others? Researchers have known for a while that a flower's color can be a signal. Color is shorthand that says to a bee, hey, I got some good quality nectar here. Why don't you stop by for a visit? But new findings show that bees also use color to get clues about a flower's temperature. And according to a study from a British research team published in the journal Nature, some like it hot. Bees use up a lot of energy just staying warm on some days. In fact, they can't even fly if they're too cold. So if one flower is warmer than another, a bee can save some of its fuel by basking on that flower while it's doing its pollinating business. And it turns out that bumblebees consistently do choose warmer flowers over cooler ones, even when the two flowers offered up the same quantity and quality of nectar. Some plants seem to be evolutionarily adapted to be slightly warmer because the warmer ones get visited more by the chilly bees. When it comes to getting pollinated, apparently the heat is on, and that's the buzz.
So I think you all know what I mean by globalization, don't you? This is the idea that we all live in a global village. With instant communications, we can share ideas and consume cultural artifacts from countries all around the world just by going on the internet and all dream up, basically. The world is shrinking. In terms of speeds, it is accelerating, but in terms of distance, it's shrinking. What do I mean by de-traditionalization? I mean the disappearance or the erosion, for the better word to use, the erosion of traditional values, of conventional ways of doing things, of conventional moralities. More and more young people around the world are rejecting the culture they grew up in, and it's probably a little bit cruel, but some imitating the Hollywood model of society rather than one which they inherit from their local tradition background. Okay?
Now, we spend a lot of time thinking about how climate will affect crops, but crops affect climate themselves, and they do this in two ways. First of all, about 1/4 of the land's surface is used for growing crops. Another 10–15% are used for pasture, so a substantial amount of the land's surface is used in crop and agricultural production. And how we use that land affects our climate. If we were, for example, to deforest a substantial area and replace it with an annual crop such as soybean, then we would alter the characteristics of the land surface, alter the way that water and heat flows from the land surface to the atmosphere and back, and ultimately change the regional climate if there's a large enough change to the land surface. So this is an absolutely fascinating topic, and one that's really quite difficult to understand because of the complexity. It's difficult because it needs us as crop scientists to work even more closely with our climate scientist colleagues. And it's difficult because we have to join our models together.
But you can see from the relatively crooked and narrow streets of the city of Rome as they look from above today, you can see that, again, the city grew in a fairly ad hoc way, as I mentioned. It wasn't planned all at once. It just grew up over time, beginning in the 8th century BC. Now, this is interesting because what we know about the Romans is when they were left to their own devices, and they could build a city from scratch, they didn't let it grow in an ad hoc way. They structured it in a very methodical way that was basically based on military strategy, military planning. The Romans, they couldn't have conquered the world without obviously having a masterful military enterprise, and they everywhere they went on their various campaigns, their various military campaigns, they would build camps, and those camps were always laid out in a very geometric plan along a grid, usually square or rectangular. So when we begin to see the Romans building their ideal Roman city, they turn to that so-called castrum or military camp design.
With the concept of moral objectivism, what we're looking at is the idea that there can be some universal moral principles, some rules, some ideas, and guidelines that are valid for all people in all social environments and all situations. The idea that we can essentially have some signposts or a roadmap to guide behavior is going to be consistent across all individuals. Now, if we take a look at this in another perspective, we can come up with a view of moral absolutism. In the area of moral absolutism, basically, what we have is illustrated on the right-hand side of this slide is a very firm and unyielding boundary between what is right and what is wrong. And so, within moral absolutism, basically what you have are these non-overridable principles. They must be followed. They must never be violated, and there were no exceptions. It is always right, it is always wrong, and nothing is subject to interpretation, and nothing is dependent upon the situation.
The Human Rights Act can be seen as far-reaching, some would argue controversial in the UK's history of rights. At the same time, it can be described as a somewhat cautious document that provides the starting point for a wider application of law to rights. In many ways, the freedom protections contained in the Human Rights Act were not new to people in the UK. The Act puts into UK law most of the clauses of the European Convention on Human Rights. The Convention itself was devised following the end of the Second World War by the Council of Europe. UK law has played a significant role in the drafting of the Convention, and the UK was among the first governments to ratify the Convention in 1951. Rights are sometimes described as being of a positive or a negative nature. That's to say, some can be expressed as a right to and others as freedom from. The 1998 Act puts into place 15 specific rights and freedoms, which include rights to liberty and security, a free trial, free expression, free elections, and the right to marry and found a family. There are also freedoms from torture, from slavery or forced labor, and from discrimination on grounds such as race, sex, religion, political opinion or social origin. The Human Rights Act has been described as the start of a process. The Act itself does not expand on the provisions made by the European Convention, which some would consider as following a baseline or a minimum standard for human rights.
It is projected that people are going to suffer from a serious food crisis for the next 30 years until 2030, unless immediate action is taken. It is increasingly clear that there is an impending global food emergency that could have long-term impacts on hundreds of millions of children and adults. We must double the yield of our production by increasing 100% to feed a growing global population and to cater for the future demand of food. This is an urgent matter, and it is quite frightening. About 50 million people risk falling into extreme poverty this year. People should elevate food production now. Scientists have predicted an increase in food production of 30% to 50% for developing countries in the next 3 years. There will be an increase of the cost of the production. There is also an opportunity for developing countries to improve food systems alongside reducing poverty and increasing global resilience to shocks. We are going to look at a very interesting and important place today. It is called Mars, which is not far away from Earth. Mars is an interesting neighboring planet to Earth with a similar geological surface and landscape, such as the desert covered with rocks. Although there has not yet been evidence for the existence of water yet, the trace of heavy gases has existed on Mars for billions of years. Traces of a great amount of water in icy form, just like mountains, has been found. There is not much atmosphere, but rare gases are still found. It is possibly because heavy gases do not evaporate within a low gravity. The low gravity on Mars indicates that there may be a thin layer of the atmosphere on Mars. Therefore, Mars might be the most ideal destination other than Earth. Australia is a vibrant, multicultural country. It is home to the world's oldest continuous cultures, as well as Australians who identify with more than 270 ancestries. It mentions that Australia has the oldest culture of residence, and a quarter of the people in Australia were born overseas. Migrants make an enormous contribution to Australia's economy and provide an estimated fiscal benefit of over $10 billion in their first 10 years of settlement. Despite legal protection, too many people in Australia continue to experience prejudice and unfair treatment because of how they look or where they come from. Most new migrants say they feel a strong sense of belonging to Australia, and that this feeling deepens over time. This rich cultural diversity is one of the Australians' greatest strengths, although it has a negative effect, which we do not emphasize in detail.
Well, a historical linguist compares languages at several levels. You start out looking for basic vocabulary. All languages of the world, natural languages at least, have words for eye and head and nose and ear, and for sky and earth, and for water, sand, and for sibling, mother and father. They may not have words for uncle and aunt. It becomes much vaguer because in one culture an aunt is different when it comes from your father's side than from your mother's side. You don't include snow. Most people know what snow is, but in the tropics you don't have it. So You look for notions that are totally comparable and that occur everywhere in the world. You take the 100 or 200 most universal notions in a human life. That is what you call a basic vocabulary. So you take basic vocabularies in languages that you think are related. You look for words that sound the same.
Low achievers are more likely to drop out of school. Some boys leave school early. And the main reason is push and pull factors. The main reason of pull is that the economy and market provide many job opportunities for boys with mainly two destinations, shipping and traineeship. So dropping from school is not absolutely bad for boys. But girls don't have the same opportunities. Girls are less likely to leave school because fewer jobs are available for them. The transmission is hard. So, for girls, dropping from school is completely bad. And if they do so, they can either get part-time jobs or just stay unemployed.
Why do we need to recycle water?
Because we don't generate much new water. Chemically, the process of generating water, which is to basically taking hydrogen and oxygen and burning them to produce water, is not a process that happens a lot anymore. So in terms of our total volume of water in the world, yes, it is changing, but it's not changing significantly relative to the rate at which we are using or demanding fresh new water.
Now, there are a lot of different areas of technology involved in water recycling, and we are later in the interview going to get to industrial use and the reclamation of sewage. What about in the home at the moment? What sort of technology is being utilised in the home when we talk about water recycling?
Well, very little on average. Typically, in a modern home, we turn on the tap, we take a glass of water, we probably, in turning on that tap, flush 10 glasses of water down the sink. We take a shower, we use fresh water, we do a whole range of things, and there is nominally very little recycling of that. It goes down the drain and it goes off to a wastewater treatment plant. There is actually very, very little recycling at a local level. People don't actually say, well, I'm now going to take the water I just used, put it through a sophisticated process and reuse it and have a closed loop. It's not a closed loop in the home.
One of the most amazing things that have happened even in my lifetime is the prediction of cosmology. When I started out 40-odd years ago, we thought we knew that the universe began a Big Bang. Some people doubted even then. We thought the universe was about 10 or 20 billion years old. But now, for really very sound scientific reasons, we can say that the universe did start in a Big Bang, and it's 13.8 billion years old. So it's not 14, it's not 13, because a decimal point in there, and that's a stunning achievement to know that. And we also know that the laws of physics that apply to tiny particles inside atoms also explains what happened in the Big Bang. You can't have one without the other. A very neat example of this is that when you apply nuclear physics, that kind of physics to understand how stars work, you find out that the oldest star in the universe is about 13 billion years old. So their universe is just a little bit older than the stars. Fantastic. If we'd done it and counted it in the other way around and said that the stars were older than the universe, we would say science was in deep trouble. But it's not. Everything fits together and we know how the universe began. We got to know how the way it is. The future, that old suspects, we don't know quite well what's going on. But we got some ideas, which are as good as those ideas we had 40 years ago and how Big Bang happened.
Well, that's one aspect of what's called reducing government and modifying government to be more precise. Another aspect of what is what's called devolution, reducing and moving government power from federal to the state level. And that's the kind of rationale which you hear all of the time, all over the place. Like for example, there was an op-ed a couple of weeks ago in the New York Times by John Cogan of Hoover Institute at Stanford, who has pointed out what he called a philosophical issue that divides the Democrats from the Republicans. The philosophical issue is that the Democrats believe in big government and entitlements, while the Republicans believe in getting the power down closer to the people, to the states, because they're kind of the populist types. Well, it takes about maybe 3 seconds thought to realize that moving power down to the states, funding and so on, is just moving it away from the people for a perfectly elementary reason. But there's a hidden part of the system, of the power system, that you're not supposed to know about or think about, and that's private power.
I am trying here to capture the dynamics that is conventionally being associated with urbanization developments. And get back once again to this question of agriculture. Once you have cities and you also have the reverse of the cities, you have countryside. You have rural areas and have this relationship with urban areas, and it needs to develop agricultural goods. And you trade with increasing industrial goods. Increasing agriculture productivity reduces labor needs and opportunities in the rural areas, pushing people towards the cities. There is this notion that in order to have progress and development in cities, you need people. If everybody is busy in growing to crops, growing food that exists, you can't have people all going into the city. You need to increased productivity in the countryside. You need to have one farmer producing enough food for more than one family. And then you will have growth and productivity in the countryside, which will free of people move to the cities. In fact, in many ways, it will compel it. They will go to the cities and search for jobs and provide labor force for the production of all kinds of things.